All right, I see people are coming in. So yes, please do introduce yourselves as you come in. As we always say to people arriving at our webinars, we'd like you to address your comments and questions to panelists and attendees. There's a little drawdown box in the chat kind of box so that everyone that comes in can see your comments and questions. We will try to remind you during the course of the conversation. So without further ado, welcome to another CHRO South Africa webinar, which today we'll be exploring how the Protection of Personal Information Act impacts the human capital function. My name is Sungula Nkabinde, and I am the community manager at CHRO South Africa. So, the 12-month grace period after which to comply with the comprehensive requirements set out in Papaya ends on June 30, 2021. That's less than 2 months away. Meanwhile, the potential consequences of non-compliance can result in significant penalties, up to 10 years imprisonment and or a 10 million rand fine in administrative fees, following civil action for damages instituted by the regulator or the data subject. Now, HR has to deal with a substantial amount of personal information during its normal operations, creating significant legal risk for employers if HR employees do not process information lawfully and in compliance with Papaya. Payroll data, employee information, performance reviews, and internal email records, HR is privy to quite a lot of information gathered throughout the employee lifecycle. And that's what we're here to discuss today is what should you be aware of as the HR practitioner when it comes to Papaya. Joining us in today's discussion are Amor Berger-Schmidt, who is the director and head of the private data privacy practice at Rexmans, as well as LexisNexis HR director, Kobisa Nchona. Thank you very much, ladies. Thank you for making yourselves available today. And I think it's going to be a very insightful conversation because, we've been talking about Papaya for such a long time. And now that, the grace period is about to expire, it's time to act, and there's going to start to being some real consequences for those who don't adhere to the piece of legislation. So without further ado, I'd like for myself and Kobisa to go off screen. Amor is going to just give us a lay of the land vis-a-vis Papaya and it's relevant for HR professionals. Take it away, Amor.
Wonderful. Morning, everyone. We prepared this short presentation just to go through the issues that we need to discuss today and try and unpack where we are and where we ought to be moving. And I think this is part of what we want to discuss today. So yeah, we looking at data privacy and looking at it from a human resources and HR perspective. And this is an interesting point because, the way we consider data privacy, people are so quick to look at privacy to the outside and the rest of the world out there and think about how do we prepare and what do we present to our customers and those entities, the vendors we deal with. But this whole issue of POPI looking into the inside, POPI on the inside, we actually forget about. And therein sits a major, the bulk of privacy information in the first instance that every single company deals with. So we can't look at data privacy and turn our back on our internal operations. It is of vital importance that we actually look at what goes on within our inner circle and how do we deal with the personal information. And HR plays a crucial and a critical role in that regard. So, the reality is Papia is going to change the way we manage information, how we store information, how we secure information, or, how we process personal information. That's what the legislation is aimed at. That's also, if you read the LexisNexis book, a commentary on the protection of personal information that I co-authored. We analyze this in detail, we unpack it, we think about it, and we consider what the impact of this is. And if we look at HR, the custodian of so much sensitive personal information, and in any event, personal information as such, HR stands, it's got a central stage where it impacts and interlinks with the legislation and what we need to consider on a day-to-day basis from a privacy perspective. So just think about it, the responsibility HR carries when it comes to the protection of sensitive personal information. And can I just stop here and interrupt myself to say, yes, we've got confidential information, but then we've got personal information that, by the way, is confidential, and we've got sensitive, special personal information, health information, trade unionship, membership information, sexual orientation. All of this constitutes special personal information. And at the end of the day, the HR team sits with this wealth of information that it has to protect and think about how to process it, how to use it, how to store it on a day-to-day basis. So, in addition to all the other responsibilities that an HR individual will have, this is a new responsibility that will become very important. And it links directly to the HR responsibility to protect employees and, at the end of the day, the company. Because remember one thing, employees are the biggest, those group constitutes the biggest asset of any company. They carry the knowledge, the know-how, and without them, who are we actually? We can't operate. So, and as the custodian of that knowledge and that asset source, HR has to protect the personal information of the individuals as well. So if we look at HR's this first line of defense, when we look at data privacy and the protection of personal information, we need to think about, but what are we defending against? And we're defending against phishing attacks. Just think about it. The moment COVID started, there was an enormous increase in phishing attacks that companies were confronted with. That leads to identity theft, that impacts on our employees. It introduces hackers into the company system. So businesses are becoming more and more targets nowadays. And becoming those targets, we need to think, how do we protect our employees? So when putting together this presentation, I thought, but the information HR sits with is like gold to identity thieves out there, to those trying to access our inner sanctum and breach the privacy of our employees. So HR needs to think about, what policies do we need to put in place? What processes we need to put in place when it comes to this tremendous amount of personal information that we deal with? Because the one thing is for sure that, thieves can access that information. And what do we do to protect it? So if we just look at, the major costs associated with data breaches and the loss of employee data, they always, you need to think about reputational damages, because that is indeed a problem that we confronted with. One has to think about, the PR nightmare that comes with a data breach. But then more important, we need to think about employee disengagement. And, and in a study that I've got in my database that was done by Gallup, it indicated that the moment a company is confronted or experience a data breach where employee data gets lost or is the target of the breach, sales drop immediately, and productivity drops immediately, profitability drops immediately. Suddenly the staff turnover just jumps up and it increases, which becomes a bigger issue within the organization. And suddenly there are more safety incidents, and enormously, that percentage is 70% in 2016 already. So to think about data breaches and protecting of personal information and the loss of employee data, there's a direct impact on the value of the company. So what does this mean? And I tried in the little 20 minutes that I have this morning to come up with some practical steps that one can put forward. And in the first instance, just in a two-step process with a little reminder that we'll get to about social media accounts. Number one is always training. Provide thorough and continuous training. So what are you putting in place from an HR perspective to actually empower individuals to understand in more detail what they are dealing with, how they should be addressing privacy from an employee privacy, employee personal information perspective? And do you understand? And then, in 6 bullet points on the slide, step 1, provide thorough training. But the items to be considered is, have you actually thought about, what employees should be stored and where should it be stored, electronically or in hard copy? And then who should have access to the information? Have you got those processes in place? Because all of this feeds directly into the data privacy legislation, POPIA, and how we apply POPIA on a day-to-day basis from an HR perspective. When would we share information? And what would the process be in relation to that sharing of the information? How do we protect and how do we ensure that the information remains secure while we share it, and the importance of sharing it? And then, we know you need access to information. No one can operate in a vacuum. You need information to operate. But, what are the acceptable processes of sharing that information? Think about things like bring your own device to work or network, Wi-Fi networks or open networks over which you can share personal information. How do we deal with our employee data in these circumstances? Are you encrypting information? Should you insist that within the company your employee data ought to be encrypted? And then what are the steps? Have you got steps that you can follow if employee data will be compromised? So in the first instance, think about train to understand what it is. But then if you delve down, what are the processes and how do you train in relation to the further issues in terms of keeping personal information secure and having in place a reasonable level of compliance as the legislation requires of us? And step 2 for this morning is, to think about what is the comprehensive cybersecurity plan. This is not only an HR function. If you look at POPIA compliance, in my view, you cannot pigeonhole it to this is a legal function only, this is an IT function only, this is an HR function only. That can never be the case. Departments have to work together, and HR fulfills a very important role if we think about cybersecurity and a cybersecurity plan. And again, I've put out some bullet points for you to think about. If we look at encryption of files containing sensitive employee records and confidential information, what are the HR requirements in this regard? How do you make the business more efficient while protecting the personal information? How do you conduct an internal assessment of your HR risks? Have you thought about that? Have you got a process in place? And then back to training. Training is not a once-off process. New induction, new processes. Everyone needs to understand what personal information is about and what the Protection of Personal Information Act actually requires of all of us to abide by. We need to understand whether we've got the skills in-house to address the privacy gaps or risks, or do we need external skills? And what will be the HR role to be played if a security breach should occur? So that whole incident security policy impacts directly on how we deal with the information of our employees and how do we protect that. So 2 steps to think up, to put it out on your canvas if you think about compliance with the data privacy legislation. And then this footnote that I've got at the bottom of the screen dealing with protecting employees' social media accounts. You know, it can be so dangerous if a social media account gets hacked or accessed or misused. And how do we think about social media within the company? What policies do we roll out in this regard to actually protect our company and our employees? So I am quickly running out of time. And therefore, in the last 10 minutes this morning, I want to take you through and stand still and focus a bit on what I deem the 8 core principles. And the 8 core principles flows from a Lexis presentation we did, I don't know, around about a year ago, where we spoke about the myths around data privacy. So if we look about the 8 core principles, and for this morning, this is the most important slide that you need to remind yourself of if you think about data privacy, POPIA, and the HR function. Number 1, the concept of transparency. That is a core fundamental principle set out in the protection of personal information legislation. So individuals that engage with any company, any organization, and how we engage with the individuals, whether it's employees, whether it's contractors, whether it's applicants or interns wanting to join the company, need to be provided with information and detail that they can easily access and understand. And what they need to understand is how will their personal information be used and for what purpose. That is the first core fundamental principle. Be open and communicate. So if we look at it from where I'm standing, from a worksman's perspective in advising clients to consider compliance with POPIA, and we look at POPIA on the inside, i.e. how do we deal with the personal information of our employees. First thing that comes to mind for me is, but do we have an employee privacy policy or privacy notice in place? How do we communicate with our employees what we do with the information? For what purpose? How long will we keep it? And when will we delete it out of the system? That policy is core and it's in line with a reasonable level of compliance with POPIA. We need to be transparent. Secondly, I think in terms of a core principle is the principle that individuals do have rights and we need to respect those rights. POPIA is clear in spelling out the rights of individuals. Therefore, as the core custodian of employee information, HR needs to be aware of the individual rights, that right to access, the right to objection, the right to rectification of personal information. So what do I mean if I say access? In terms of POPIA, a data subject, being an employee, can request details as to exactly what personal information of mine do you hold. They can request for it to be corrected, they can rectify it, they can request for it to be deleted. As HR, you need to sit still, look at your processes and think, but how will we give credence to these rights that data subjects have? And how will we be dealing with this? So HR teams must be able to recognize and deal with individual requests. The question is, how will you be doing it? And this is an aspect that you need to address and that you need to think about in your processes, in your procedures, in becoming compliant with the data privacy legislation. Also, the question of lawful processing. Lawful processing is such a fundamental aspect of data privacy legislation. Now, what it actually entails is to say, but you can't just use information, send it around, file it, share it with other people without a lawful basis for doing so. And the legislation prescribes a lawful basis, and you need to determine and assess which lawful basis you will be relying on. Now, I want to raise one thing with you this morning. Too often we see in South Africa currently that people grasp at consent and say, I've got consent so I can do with the personal information whatever I want to do. That is not the truth. And I wish to warn you and say to you, be careful when you rely on consent. Consent can be withdrawn at any second. When a data subject withdraws consent, and that's the ground that you rely on for the processing of his or her or its personal information, you must stop immediately. Therefore, you're not allowed to further process the personal information. Also, in an HR environment and situation, consent is frowned upon internationally because there's no balanced playing field. The individual is absolutely not on an equal level in terms of rights, the employee with the employer. So as an employee, you're going to say, yes, no, it's fine, I consent. You need to think about legitimate interest or whether there's a contract, but specifically legitimate interest as a lawful basis for processing, and be clear and do an analysis and think about it. Then the question that data, personal information must be up to date. You must process the minimum amount of information and retain it for the shortest period of time. If we consider the fifth core principle, think about who do you share the personal information with? Are you allowed to share this? Do you have a lawful basis to share that personal information? So if we send information around from HR into the bigger firm, you need to be sure that you're allowed to do that in terms of the protection of personal information. And it links directly to when we transfer personal information, the information of employees to other countries. If you're a global entity and you transfer information to other subsidiaries or to the head office in, for argument's sake, France, do you have a lawful basis for that processing? Do you comply with the data privacy legislation? And you as HR, as the custodian of the personal information of employees, must understand these issues. We dealt with data breaches a bit earlier on when I mentioned the impact on companies. But again, you need to understand that a data breach is not necessarily a cyber attack. It can be something as simple as an email that gets forwarded with an email trail attached to it, with something, as it says on the screen there at the end, she's not coming to work today because her daughter has chickenpox. That is personal information. On top of it, it's special personal information because we're dealing with the information of children. So therefore, if we link it back to where we started off, step one, training, understand what the important aspects are that we need to consider about. And then accountability. You are accountable for that personal information. The information regulator will hold you accountable. So how do you demonstrate your accountability with the protection of personal information? And if we link it back to the first core principle, number one, that comes from transparency. So to summarize where we are in terms of the protection of personal information, the HR function, the importance, what should we do, what should we immediately think about? And I would suggest what is required is that, we introduce detailed privacy protection, data protection, policies and training, because without that, you're absolutely disempowered, that you will have in place internal controls to regulate, to review and audit the processes to make sure that you comply with the legislation on a regular basis. And more importantly, you must understand your data processing activities. Without understanding your data privacy processes and activities, you will never be able to understand where the gaps are in terms of complying with the data privacy legislation. So this has been a 20-minute whirlwind, giving you certain pointers and guidance to think about data privacy from an HR perspective. But the one thing that I am absolutely convinced about, if we only look at data privacy and consider data privacy legislation with a view as to the outside world, we are failing our obligations when it comes to a reasonable level of compliance with the legislation, because the information we hold, each and every single company and HR division hold of its employees, constitutes a pot of gold that we need to protect, and we've got a responsibility to protect that. Thank you very much.
Thank you very, very, very much, Amor. I think that was a very comprehensive presentation that has really set the stage for us in terms of, really getting into the discussion of how our HR professionals can be better prepared and equipped to protect the employers and the employees really from the threats and risks that come with the Papaya. I'm launching a poll quickly before we get to Globisa, who's going to share the LexisNexis experience, just to find out, how far everybody is within the attendees today with their journey. Have you guys considered the impact of Papaya on your HR policies? Is there anybody, who is in charge, or is there a plan to really have your bases covered once the grace period expires next month? And it seems that the numbers are quite balanced. I'll give it a couple of seconds while I wait for Globisa. Globisa, are you there?
Yes, I am.
Yeah. So just before you get into your presentation, I just want to, see how far this poll gets. It's looking quite neck and neck with our attendees today, with pretty much down the middle, and people saying, no, we don't have a plan for Papaya in our HR policy, and the other half saying, yes, they do. So it's quite balanced. And I think for at least half of the people here, if not everybody, this is a very important conversation to attend. So there we have it. Half of the people here are thinking about it, while the rest are not yet started with their plans. As you can see, there are the results for those in attendance. Globisa, what about LexisNexis? I mean, where do you fall within the spectrum? I see you have done a lot of work with Amor. So it's fair to assume that you have been taking these precautions. How far along are you with your journey, and what have you done thus far?
All right, so thanks, Sungula. And I think thanks to Amor. I mean, we've been on some of these webinars for quite some time. And I must say, Amor, every time I attend, I always feel like I learn something new. So always thanks for sharing. So I think just from a LexisNexis perspective, so I think in most cases, we are like most of the companies out there that have been on this journey, just in terms of compliance to POPIA. But I think maybe if I put a base to what we do, so LexisNexis as a firm is a leading provider of legal, regulatory, business information and analytics. And I think by nature of the services and the products that we do, we've long recognized the importance of data privacy, data protection. And I think what has a bit helped in our context is that most of how we go about in managing, utilizing data is always global in nature and has privacy as the cornerstone of what we do. So compliance, obviously, with emerging privacy laws such as POPIA has really been building to some of the ethos of what we hold. So I'll just share briefly with the forum or the audience, just in terms of some of the aspects that we have done as a firm. So some of it is not necessarily news, I think, because Amor has predominantly touched on it in her earlier on session. So what we did when we realized as a firm that we needed to be compliant to POPIA is what helped was we have what we call a data privacy officer at a global level. And usually this team looks at all aspects that's got to do with privacy across the different markets. So when POPIA came about, I think we then did a review, a requirements review that really looked at what was coming up or what were the requirements from a POPIA perspective. We looked at this in accordance to our global privacy requirements. So I think that was really the first step that we did. And we have a massive documentation aspects, just around looking at what were the nuances that POPI brought with it. I think post that, what then this team did is, in consultation not only with the HR function, but across the various divisional BUs within the company, was we consulted just to really look around what do we foresee as being the impact of POPI. We know POPI is coming, so what do we see as the impact thereof? So post the consultation, we did privacy assessments. So it was really doing a data review, data mapping exercise around all our data assets. And then looking from a privacy perspective, do we foresee gaps, or are we seeing gaps in terms of that aspect? And then what came as a consequence of that exercise was a remediation action plan. So really where we saw we had some gaps, then obviously what were some of the remediation plans that that came through. So that's some of the initial steps we did. So we also had to look at internal policies. So we do have internal privacy and security policies. And because they are global, it did help a bit, because we found that they were aligned to POPI. So we did have that. But I think at an internal level, I mean, Amor was spot on to say a lot of the focus is usually to the external environment. But I think what our team has now done is they were busy building what they call an internal data subject tool. So around where you have requests on data and all of that. So they built that, and it's something that we're rolling out. We did immense training. So training, not only to the HR functions, I think one for the function itself, but I think across the organization around POPI, around privacy. We roll out a lot of phishing exercises around how to store data, how to utilize data, be it on company networks and stuff like that. So we did a lot of that, but I think what helped is, I mean, I mentioned earlier, Amor in conjunction with Lexis has really been doing some awareness, educational webinars around POPI itself, what we should be on the lookout for. So we did ensure that our organization partakes in terms of these webinars, and insofar as that is concerned, the HR teams as well partook in terms of that. So we did do a lot of training. We are still on the journey of training, because as things unfold, you need to ensure that you accommodate for people that have newly joined, refresh people's minds around it. So those are some of the stuff we did. We also looked at contracts reviews. So where we just needed to ensure where all our contracts just aligned to privacy elements that were out there. I think the big thing that we are busy with now is we are finalizing the appointment of our information officer. And I think what we're doing is we are really ensuring that it complies to the requirements, where this person will be of a senior nature, but also ensure and be up to the task of ensuring that our data is handled in a confidential, but also with the utmost of integrity that it deserves. So those are some of the stuff. And I think just lastly, it was really around the elements of security. So we do, and we have worked with our IT divisions as well, just in terms of just looking around global security policies that we have in place. And I think we are busy now finalizing some of those stuff. So those are some of the aspects that we do. And I think what we had to also go and just make sure is where we store our data. So we also utilize an enterprise resource tool. But I think what we found as part and parcel of just having the assessments of whether it was going to align to POPI was that it was built with security in mind. So it does have elements around how to handle, manage, purge data that aligned to POPI. So I would probably say, in a nutshell, those are some of the aspects that we've done to evolve as an HR function. I think, as mentioned before, we are on the journey as well, like other companies. We did also inquire a few challenges along the way. And I think one of the something I would say was a challenge, but I think with the help of just understanding what POPI stood for, we're able to navigate. It was one of the things we found is that because the information regulator is also establishing and embedding itself, right? So we had to also kind of work hand in hand and get a sense of what was the guidance coming from there, outside of obviously the normal webinars or educational aspects that were underway. So I probably would say those were some of the aspects that we have done and are also busy with, just to ensure that we are ready come the end of June.
Thank you very much, Thobisa. We're now going to get into the Q&A session. I know we don't normally leave this much time, but I think because of the nature of the subject matter, where it's important to have these particular experts to answer our questions, we need to leave more time for questions. And I think I'll start with the questions, and please do get your questions in. We do have a few so far, but I think we can do with a few more. Please remember to address your questions to panelists and attendees so that all your fellow attendees can see what you're asking. Thobisa, I'm back to you, what you've done so far. You operate within the legal space somewhat. So I guess that enabled you to kind of get ahead of the curve in terms of preparing for this. But what would you say has been the biggest challenge, whether it's from a mindset point of view or just a logistic obstacle that you've had to overcome in terms of getting the ball rolling?
So I think it's a fair point to say we operate within the legal realm, but I think within that comes a massive load of wanting to ensure that you get things right. So I think probably I would say we also once when POPI came on, we were probably not that quick to truly just interrogate the gaps between what the requirements were versus where we needed to be. So I'd probably say that was one of the things. But I think what was our saving grace was only because we already adhere to global privacy requirements. And I think if I look at a group level, there's elements around it where there's alignments to GDPR in Europe or the CCPA in the US. So I think some of those kind of, I would say, helped us along the route, because what we found was from a remediation perspective, there was not a lot that we had to do. So I would probably think it's that. But I think what was also raised by Amor earlier on was we in HR, and I think sometimes we take consent as, you know what, we've gotten the consent, but it's really interrogating the dilemma that comes with that perspective. So I think those were some of the things we really had to look at. It was easy as well for our organization to go about with the relevant security exercises, because a lot of the focus is always on cyber attacks and all of that. But I think for us, it was just the culture around, instilling the culture around how do you ensure that data is managed in a secure way, because sometimes we take me sending an email to someone for granted, the whole password encryption thing, sometimes we take for granted. So it was really just how do we instill a culture that not only is focused on external attacks, which were cyber and all of that, but to say how do we as a function become responsible around the data that we are making use for in a day-to-day basis. So I think those were some of the things, but it is, I would say it is really a culture shift in terms of how you look at it and how you practice the utilization of data on a day-to-day basis.
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, it sounds to me like it's the most important jump for employees to make is that mindset shift. Similar to things like health and safety, once you come to the COVID regulations, it's that, changing your mindset to prioritize something that you took for granted, like washing your hands for 10 minutes and properly, just to be cognizant of health and safety. And I suspect that it will be very similar with Papaya, that people must be very cognizant of the way they're treating the data that they come across and how they store it and process it, etc. Now, the poll we have that is up right now is about the areas of Papaya that you are struggling with. Again, it seems to be very evenly distributed, but I'm just going to go through the options before I ask you to comment on the poll results some more. So with about, let me just wait for enough people to vote here, and then publish the results for attendees to also see what we are talking about. Yes, so among the areas that people are struggling with, 27% have said that the appointment of an information officer is their key challenge. 21% retention register is a challenge. 38%, which is the second highest, saying formulating a breach plan. 23% say agreement review and update. 43% saying integration of Papaya and Papaya. 25% saying training, and lastly, which is the most voted, is saying 50% saying drafting policies, procedures, and terms and conditions are among the highest. Does this resonate in any way? I mean, is this something that sticks out that you think makes sense with regard to the application of Papaya?
Yes, Ngula, if you look at drafting policies, procedures, and terms and conditions, I fully understand. And in fact, that's the big part of the work we assist with, because the problem here lies in the fact, and I see one of the questions on the the Q&A also relates to how did Lexis go about to understand the gaps and where the shortcomings are. That's actually the fundamental problem. If you don't understand the gaps and you don't understand the life cycle of the information, and I'm not talking about detailed business process mapping here, I'm talking about a data mapping exercise to map your data and do that impact assessment, to understand why you've got the personal information, what you do with it, where does it go, who are the custodians, what's the flow within the company. Without that, you cannot draft your policies or your procedures or your terms and conditions. That links back to the issue of transparency. Now, what do we see in practice? We often see that we will be asked by companies to comment on their privacy policies, and then we present it with a document that's actually just a reflection of the legislation in different words. That's not a privacy policy. I am sad to announce that. If you've got a privacy policy like that, please go back to your drawing board, because that is not a privacy policy that meets the test of the legislation. Because if you look at a policy that will reflect a reasonable level of compliance with the legislation, that is a policy that will tell a data subject what information, for what purpose, to whom, how long, where to, everything that will be done with his, her, or its personal information. And that's the level that you need to think about if you draft a policy. So, on that basis, I can understand that it is you have to sit still. It's complicated. You have to sit still. You have to focus on this. You're not just going to do it in the fly and quickly pull something together. And it links directly to your procedures and what you said, health and safety. There's a massive element of change management in this process that we need to think about, because we are asked to think differently. We were never expected to deal with personal information in the way that POPIA now requires of us to do it. So it is a different way of thinking, and the processes and the procedures. And those processes and procedures link directly to your data subject access request, to your breach plan and process, to your retention register. All of that links to the other elements that you've got in terms of the poll. And then one last comment from me on that integration between POPIA and Papaya. I would advise that you log onto the Information Regulator's website. We've got the draft guideline on Papaya. We need to remember we've got two distinct pieces of legislation under the umbrella of the Information Regulator. And the regulator recognized that we need guidance as a business community, and therefore they've issued the current draft guidelines on Papaya. So let's also keep track and keep in pace with what the information regulator actually requires of us. And those guidelines form a very good basis to inform you which way to go. But I can understand that it's a difficult concept in general to just, get your head around and get thinking about it. But if we understand what we do with personal information on a day-to-day basis, the Act actually becomes very transparent and clear as to how we apply it to our business.
All right, thank you. I mean, that follows up. I have another question here, which I'd really like you to address. Do you think that is best to outsource this compliance function, or is it possible to do it on your own? Because it sounds like the expertise that is required to do this properly, not many organizations will have that internally, but also there's a culture element that an external party might not be privy to. So what's the best way for HR practitioners to approach this if they don't have the capacity to do it internally?
Yeah. So if we consider something like an impact assessment and a gap analysis, to a certain level, I think you do need the experience and the expertise to succinctly interpret it and identify the gaps. And that is an area where you can look at external resources to assist with compiling that assessment or gap analysis exercise to assist with that. That impact assessment, gap analysis, is also a function of your information officer. So you need to address it somehow and think about how you're going to address it in the most economical way possible. But do I think in all instances you need to outsource everything? No, I don't think so. Because at the end of the day, and this is something that we as a team fundamentally believe in, as external advisors, you can never know the internal details of a company, like the people, the HR department working in that environment every day. So if you can't form a close team with your advisors, I think you will erode the value that you'll get out of the exercise. So you have to work closely, or there are certain roles and functions which provides clearly and succinctly for an external expertise to assist in that regard. But one option you can follow also is to prepare documents and get external guidance on, are we on the right track? Have we done the right, undertaken the right steps? The content, are there issues with the content? Remember, POPIA requires a reasonable level of compliance with the legislation. So this is not perfection. This is, are we complying to a reasonable level with the legislation? And that will be tested by the information regulator. And that's a good area to get advice in, to see whether you are, in fact, meeting the test of a reasonable level of compliance with the legislation. But the bigger the organization, the more personal information you're dealing with internally and externally, especially if you make use of huge groups of consultants that you appoint or expats all over the world, that impact assessment becomes complicated. And in those instances, I think it is actually advisable to think about pulling in external expertise to assist with the process.
Thank you, Amor. Kobisa, I have a question for you from Jade Madue. She is asking, how did you do your privacy assessment?
All right, so I think a part of it is just linked to the previous response from Amor. So I think what we also were faced with was, yes, we, from an internal perspective, understood certain aspects, but we also had a global privacy team that came by, and there was an aspect where we sourced in, and I think around the privacy as well as elements on the training where we sourced in some guidance to come in. So I think it was that amount of effort that came through. And I think what the different teams helped us with was really in scoping what were we required to do from a POPI perspective. So we put that out. And also from a firm perspective in terms of data, handling of it, storage of it, where and how were we going about that? And then when we looked at the two, then it gave us what were the requisite gaps that we were facing. And then we had to look at then how do we go and rectify those. So I think it was that, but I do think it was a tiered type of approach where we had local HR teams working on it. We had global teams from a privacy perspective, but we did source out some local external guidance as well, just to really assist us to ensure that we are really tackling where we have areas of gaps. I probably would say what I found, I would say, is it's good to get help in if the goal as well is that when the help leaves, you as a team understand. I think what we found initially was that if we get the help in to just come and do an advice and then leave, and then they don't leave any source of knowledge that we had left behind, then we would still be grappling about it. But I think it was an effort of the local team in a nutshell, the global privacy teams, and then some of the external experts around POPIA coming in to help us with those assessments.
Okay, thank you very much. The next question, which I think will be for you, Amor, is besides having a POPI privacy policy, would there be a need to have an addendum or an extra to the employment contract for past and new staff?
Yeah, well, from the Worksman's team, we do believe that you need to have addendums to your employee agreements. It is important. It's a new piece of legislation. It's like a new policy that we need to roll out. And then obviously employment agreements will have a clause stating that you'll comply with all policies, current policies within the company. So the rollout of that policy then, and the education and the awareness drive around that becomes very important. So it, it is not, I often look at it and I often sit with clients and the thought that comes to mind is, this is not a cookie cutter approach. So I can't sit here and give any of, this is not a perfect puzzle that we're building. Each company differs in terms of its requirements, but there are things that you need to have the following in place. You need to do a gap analysis. But can I tell the audience this morning that a single gap analysis impact assessment report and process that we've done as a Worksman's team had exactly the same outcome? No, I can't. Each one is different and each one introduces new aspects. I see one of the questions on the screen is, but how do we deal with the Department of Labor? How do we, and it's the same, how do we deal with this COVID results and everything we have to process and collect and pass on to government? Now, that is, in terms of the legislation, a lawful basis for processing. The legislation says if there's a law that requires this, you're allowed to do it. But how do we deal with that in our internal employee privacy notice? And are we aware within HR what we can and what we can't do? And that, again, brings us back to our impact assessment, our gap analysis. Do you understand which laws actually apply to your day-to-day operations? Because that is required for you to understand, if I look at lawful processing of personal information, where do I fit this in? On what basis do I defend it? Because I said during the presentation, you do not want to rely on consent. Consent must be your last basis for lawful processing that you rely on. It's far better to look at legitimate interest, or whether there's a contract in place, or whether that there's a law that obliges you to process the personal information. And then can I just make one last comment, because I see now suddenly, as always, time starts running. Mm-hmm. If you've got a privacy policy, that privacy policy must also be, to an extent, reflected or pulled through to your agreements that you enter into service providers. And in terms of the POPIA legislation, especially if we appoint third-party service providers, the legislation says there must be a contract between us. There are security, data security obligations. So this is why it's so necessary for all of us to think and rethink what our agreements look like, And do we have the required privacy clauses in those agreements to actually protect ourselves, to demonstrate that we've got a reasonable level of compliance? And yes, if we look at Monique's question on the screen, are clients obliged to comply with our POPIA policy, as well as own in the event they contradict each other? That is an agreement that we need to put in place. Remember, your privacy policy is a policy. Then you've got an agreement. At the end of the day, you need to ensure what you agree with a third party is compliant with the legislation. And I would expect that your privacy notice or policy complies with the legislation. I would find it very much bizarre if there's a conflict between two privacy policies to such an extent that the relationship cannot work and cannot proceed. Then there must be a problem in one of those policies, because the fundamental principles remain the same that informs both policies.
All right, thank you, Amor. And yeah, you are very right in observing that we are running out of time, and there are quite a few questions that we still have not been able to get through. I assure the audience that I will forward these onto our panel of experts and have them respond via email and try to get the answers to you directly. But before we close, I do have one more question for Kobisa, and this comes from myself. Kobisa, within, all of this has been happening in the context of COVID, which has accelerated the shift towards virtual working and virtual recruitment. So how was LexisNexis able to respond to these changes while also ensuring their compliance with the Papaya?
All right, so I always say it's been an interesting maybe 12 months being in HR, only because not only do you have POPIA come in, but we also had aspects around recruitment. But I think from a recruitment perspective, I think what we found was we had to obviously look in terms of the process, procedures, and how we go about that process itself. So I mentioned earlier that we do utilize an employee resources tool that stores, handles our data, but also it does handle how we go about recruitment. The major though consideration was, I think we were initially excited with the aspects that our tool did have the functionality around candidate consent. So we thought, oh, okay, all is fine, until we actually realized, no, it actually is not the only pillar you have to look at. So we had to look around things on now, what's the interest around why we're using the data and all of those things. But I think other aspects that we had to ensure were built in was stuff around restricted access, where access is utilized on a need-to-know basis and by whoever is needed to do that. We had to review how we go about reporting and how we aggregate how we report. We also had to test that we had the right security controls around user activity to ensure that the users are doing the activities that they need to and not stuff that they didn't have to. And I think what's been key around recruitment is really the aspects around how we store, when to purge information, how to mask the data that we have. And I think what we had to ensure was that the tools we use have functionalities that not only mask data as and when needed, but when they purge, it really is permanently and irreversible. So I think those were the aspects that we had to look at, because we had to ensure that now recruitment, for instance, is done on a much more virtual basis. So there's more reliance around the type of tools that we use. So we just had to ensure that from a securities perspective, that our recruitment process tools where we store the data really does stand the compliance test that's required from a POPIA perspective.
All right. And that brings us to the end of our conversation today. Thank you very much, Amor and Kobisa, for joining us. It was a very insightful conversation. I do feel that we should have allocated maybe a lot more time to this conversation, because like I said earlier, we haven't been able to get around to all the questions, but we will ensure that we send them to our experts and hopefully get back to you via email. So thank you very much. Before I close, I'd just like to bring your attention to our upcoming sessions. Tomorrow, we have a discussion about performance management reboot with our tandem, where we have guests Carol Kaufman from Standard Bank and Ashling Taylor from our tandem. And thereafter, on the 10th of June, we'll be discussing everything you need to know about vaccine rollouts and how they impact your safety and wellness strategy. Given the time that we're in now and you know, the whole conversation about the third wave, I think that will also be a very good one for you to attend. So lots of very insightful conversations coming up within the CHRO South Africa calendar. I hope to see you all very soon. But again, I'd like to thank you both for joining us. And I think it's been a good conversation overall.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you very much. Cheers all.
Thank you. Have a good day.
Bye.
Bye-bye.